Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for tuning in and joining us for what is going to be a fascinating discussion on one of the most pertinent topics of our time, the World Health Organization, Donald Trump, China, and where things went wrong, if indeed they did go wrong. My name is Azim Ibrahim, and I'm the Director of the Displacement and Migration Programme at the Centre for Global Policy, an independent, non-partisan, US-funded think tank in Washington, DC. You can get more details of us from cgpolicy.org and follow us on Twitter at CGPDC. Please do take the time and look us up. The World Health Organization has been accused of having failed miserably in handling this crisis, a crisis which is completely unique in history. Never before has one event affected every person on the globe in the same way. And it was this failure that motivated President Trump to withdraw funding from this UN body. Is that action justified? Was President Trump correct? Or was it simply a cover for his own ineptness and his own inaction to prepare for this crisis when they had ample warning? China, on the other hand, is accused of having an oversized influence with the World Health Organization. But can a country really be blamed for filling a power vacuum that has been left because of the retreat of the world's superpower? Surely every country in that position would behave in the same way. And what does this mean for the World Health Organization and the global order moving forward? To answer some of these and many other important questions, we have assembled a stellar panel for you today. First of all, we have Bethany Allen Ibrahimian, who is a China reporter at Axios. She is the author of the weekly Axios China newsletter and covers Beijing's influences and intentions. Bethany is a graduate of Yale University and also spent many years in China and speaks fluent Chinese. And I can say with confidence that if you have not subscribed to Bethany's newsletter on China, then there is a serious gap in your China knowledge. I highly encourage you to look it up. We also have Vincent Chow, the director of the political division of the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office in the United States. Prior to this position, Vincent was the chief of staff to Taiwan's foreign minister and also served in a senior level position in the office of the President and National Security Council. We also have Professor David Fidler, an adjunct senior fellow for cybersecurity and global health at the Council on Foreign Relations and a visiting professor at the Washington University of Law in St. Louis. David has served as a legal counsel to the World Health Organization and the US Centers for Disease Control and the Prevention on Global Pandemics. He also served in the US Department of Defense Science Board on Bioterrorism. He's a Fulbright Scholar, a Truman Scholar, and holds a bachelor's in civil law from the University of Oxford and Harvard, and a JD from Harvard, and an MPhil in international relations, also from the University of Oxford. We're also expecting our panelists, a few other panelists to join who may join later, but I'll give you their bios. We have James Palmer, the senior editor of Foreign Policy magazine in Washington, where he heads the China project. He's a graduate of Cambridge University and spent a number of years in Beijing working as the editor of the English language Global Times. He's also the author of the highly acclaimed The Death of Mao, the Tangshan Earthquake, and the Birth of the New China. Finally, we are expecting some officials from the World Health Organization. I'm not sure if they managed to get in yet. They're having some technical issues, but we were expecting Dr. Maria van Kerkhove, who's the Executive Director of Emergencies at the World Health Organization. She's a graduate of Stanford and a specialist in infectious diseases. We're also expecting Dr. Mike Ryan, who's a technical lead for the COVID response. He's an expert epidemiologist and trained in Ireland and is responsible for the international response. So let me first of all start off with Dr. David Fidler. I'm going to start off with a very softball question for you, David. You had inside experience with the World Health Organization. You served in that role, you served in many other roles. So a very easy softball for you. Did the World Health Organization fail? And if so, why did it fail? And if it didn't, why is this huge effort to try to portray as if they failed?
Well, I don't think the World Health Organization has failed in its response to this particular pandemic. What we're trying to figure out is how the WHO got into the political hot water that it finds itself in, and then try to find a strategy for moving WHO back into the role of global health leadership that it's traditionally had. For me, the reason that we find ourselves asking these questions is that this pandemic or this outbreak arose in a context in which balance of power politics had returned to international relations. And this is the first time, at least in 25 years that I've been following these issues, that we've had a disease outbreak immediately become a geopolitical fight between the two, biggest powers, the United States and China. From the very beginning, this pandemic has been framed in geopolitical terms by both countries, and both countries have wanted certain things from both the WHO and other countries in terms of the response for that. And I think it's that context that put WHO in a very difficult political situation. And the questions that we're asking are trying to figure out how WHO navigated that. What did other countries do? We have questions that we need to ask not just of WHO, but of other countries, including the United States, in terms of their response, if we're going to figure out who acted in the best interest of global health.
Thanks so much for that, David. Vincent, the same question to you. The WHO, did it fail? And if it didn't, why not?
I think we're, in terms of the WHO, we're always focused on one particular issue, which is the issue of Taiwan's participation. And we think that holds particular relevance given the coronavirus pandemic that we're all facing. So let me reframe your question in the context of Taiwan. Number one, has Taiwan played an important role kind of in shaping regional responses to the coronavirus? We think it has. We think Taiwan has been a success story. It has been a widely recognized model. And right now we're in a position to contribute many of our best practices, as well as, frankly, medical equipment to places around the world. Second question is, can WHO take advantage of that, and have they? No, they haven't. And this is why we think that on the context of Taiwan alone, WHO response to the coronavirus hasn't taken into account Taiwan's response the way it should have. And, I think there's a long story behind this, and there's a long, history of problems and deficiencies within the WHO in terms of Taiwan. But on this particular issue itself, we feel that Taiwan has a lot to contribute on, and frankly, the WHO has not taken advantage of it. And, if that constitutes a failure on their part, so be it.
Bethany, do you share that interpretation of what Vincent said, that this is a failure of the WHO?
I think the answer there is going to be both yes and no. I mean, I think a really important thing to keep in mind is that the World Health Organization has a budget of about $2 billion. It's really not a huge, enormous bureaucracy with a lot of power. If you want to compare it to, America's own CDC, it has just a fraction of the funding. So I think to look to the World Health Organization alone to say that they are the cause, their failures are the cause of this global pandemic is an insufficient line of questioning. But since it is the topic of this panel, I think that it's important to help bring us out of this very intense sort of geopolitical situation that we're in, as David noted. I would like to go back in history just a few years and say that some of the criticisms that have been lobbed at the WHO are not, in fact, unique to this moment of geopolitical tensions between the US and China. If you look back at 2009 with H1N1, if you look at 2014 with Ebola, some of the exact same criticisms were directed at the WHO, that it was slow to respond, that it needs reform. And in fact, in 2014, there were voices saying that the world should have should start a new organization, that the World Health Organization just it's so incompetent, or just there's so many problems that the world needs to start over from scratch. Those were calls that were made in 2014, and that had nothing to do with China. We've seen some of those same criticisms here, that it was slow to respond, that maybe we just need to start over afresh. The difference, of course, is that there is a really strong geopolitical element. And it's very clear that, at least in public statements, the WHO has made a choice not to criticize the Chinese response to the coronavirus. And we can compare that with 2003. On April 7th, 2003, the World Health Organization did criticize China for its response to SARS. And there are absolutely elements, there was a cover up, there were insufficiencies in the Chinese response that the World Health Organization has not pointed out. In addition to that, if you look at statements from the WHO chief, Ghebreyesus, he said certain things that really have nothing to do with the overall response, but that just seem like they might have been, fed to him from Beijing. When he criticized Taiwan for, some racist remarks, and yet did not criticize, the overt racism against Africans in southern China, when they were viewed as being somehow, dirty, or there were suspicions that they had coronavirus. Anyway, so I think that the WHO response certainly was insufficient, but I think that the failures and the reason we've had a global pandemic go far beyond just that one organization.
So James, do you agree with that statement? Failure of the WHO, the Director General was being fed from Beijing and ignoring information from Taiwan. I don't think there's not many people, I think, that know China better than you. What's your interpretation of that?
I think that Tedros showed every sign of something that's really common by people who exist in big institutions themselves and are trying to deal with China. In that he saw the Chinese as being fundamentally on his side, as being on the side of the institution. And when he felt under attack, he thus started to regurgitate the lines being given to him by those very nice Chinese officials he was talking to. And we see that across the board. We see that kind of institutional capture of ambassadors, of high-level businessmen. Beijing has a very worked out playbook for how to woo over, frankly, egotistical, institutionalized, perhaps somewhat narcissistic leaders. Whether those are leaders, that's people, going there for a week to write a column for the Financial Times, or people from the UN, or ambassadors who end up serving Beijing's interests more than their own. We've seen that time and again. But beyond that, a lot of the problems that the WHO faces are essentially the problems of any international institution dealing with Beijing, in that Beijing will not give you any kind of access, will not allow you to do the kind of work that you need to do as an international organization that helps people, looking at health information, looking at the poor, whatever it is, unless you play by Beijing's rules. And that's not the case with, say, the United States. Even under the Trump administration, places are still able to get access, to go to visit. So I think often international institutions end up making these compromises because they have no other way to get the information that they need, and that's an important part of their work. If you criticize Beijing, if you criticize the Chinese response, you won't get to send a medical team to Wuhan at all. If you don't behave in an obsequious way, you won't be invited back. And I think it is possible to walk a tougher line on these than the WHO and other groups have done. It's possible to carefully word your statements so that they don't give the undue credibility to Beijing while also avoiding crossing Beijing's red lines. But as the political paranoia inside the Chinese system becomes worse and worse, that's also becoming harder and harder. And we're seeing a little bit of that in the United States, of course, with the Trumpian response. But ultimately in the United States, the insanity and racism and cruelty of the Trump administration is contained by being part of a democratic system with a free press and its inability to stop people from, say, going to hospitals or talking to doctors. And across the board, all manner of international institutions are going to have to face those problems in working with a Beijing that's both newly empowered and increasingly nasty.
Thanks so much for that, James. I believe we have Gabriella Stern on the line now. She's the Director of Communications from the WHO. So Gabriella, do you want to just talk upon what the panelists have just mentioned? Can you hear us? I think she's having some
Good
issues.
afternoon. I don't know if you can hear us. I think there may be some confusion.
Yep.
This is Dr. Mike Ryan, the Executive Director of the Emergencies Program here in Geneva, with Maria Van Kerkhoff, our Health Technical Lead, and Steve Solomon, our Legal Counsel, who specialises in managing our relationship with Taiwanese health authorities. Sorry, thanks for thanks for inviting us. Very much appreciate the opportunity to interact, and please bring us in when you feel it's appropriate, and we can share out the work between us.
Yeah, no, so the question is to you, Dr. Ryan, you know, there's obviously accusations made against the WHO and its failure. You know, how would you respond to that? What's your interpretation? You're obviously on the front line, you're leading this response. You know, how would you react to the misinformation that seems to be perpetuating?
I think there's definitely an infodemic underway and maybe a misinfodemic as well. We need to look very hard, both after this epidemic and pandemic, where all of this misinformation has come from. I'm sure everyone will bear their own part of that process. I have someone who's worked for many years, more than 25 years in this space, and I can assure you, as the head of the program here, just when you were speaking about the process, this is impossible. Can you turn down the gain on this? Sorry, we've got technical issues here. A lot has been said about the insufficiencies and many other issues here. I think we need to separate. No, this is impossible. I'm sorry.
Dr. Ryan, could you possibly press upon what misinformation you're particularly referring to? You said that there's lots of misinformation, but what misinformation that's been perpetuated around you? What is it you're specifically referring to?
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's just really hard to hear you now because there's a whole lot of gain and feedback in this room. I'm just asking the technicians to please turn down the volume in the room. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah. So
okay,
I was saying, Dr. Ryan, could you possibly just touch upon which misinformation are you referring to that's been perpetuated, which is incorrect?
Yeah, no. I think when we refer to misinformation, all epidemics are associated with information and misinformation, and I think the saddest part of that is not what you're talking about, the geopolitical intrigues that may or may not exist around the world. The sad outcome of this is misinformed communities, communities divided, people not sure, not trusting in government, not trusting in multi-party leadership, and having lack of national and international unity at a time when it's needed. And those who prey upon the emotions of our communities at this time, and some are the trolls who sit in basements and others are elsewhere. We all, including WHO, have a responsibility to communicate clearly, honestly, and as openly as we can on these matters. So when I talk about misinformation, it's really what conversation are we having amongst ourselves? What conversation are we having with our communities and those that we serve? And are we operationalizing and weaponizing a pandemic for political purposes, whatever they may be it domestic politics, be it international geopolitics? The question is, when are these questions to be answered? All I know is since the 31st of December, our teams here have been full bore trying to do our best from a public health perspective to both assess and communicate around this event. And I can assure you from my perspective, I spent 25 years in this game, I answer to nobody other than my conscience when it comes to this. And I have been entirely independent in my decision making on this, and so has Dr. Tedros. Dr. Tedros and no one has never once interfered in my operational or public health decision making. I make the technical calls here. The DG runs the organization. My job is to run the emergencies program. And I'm sure when this comes to an end, we will go back. I'm quoted on the dust cover of a book about SARS, and I was the operational coordinator for SARS 25 years ago. So I've cut my teeth on some pretty serious events in the past. And I was quoted on a dust cover of the book, of a book written about SARS, where I was quoted as saying, the first thing you do in an emergency is make mistakes. The second thing you do if you're smart is learn from your mistakes and move on and get the job done right. Now, if anybody in the world can claim that in an emergency situation they have done 100% of everything right, then we're looking at God. Yeah. For those of you who believe God exists, that's fantastic. And for those that you believe that God doesn't exist, then it's a unicorn. So I do think there will be a time when we need to come back and look at this event in the cold light of day and how we all performed in that. I can only assure you that from the perspective of WHO, from the 31st of December, right the way through, we have openly communicated the information we have. We had 3 missions to China, or in Wuhan and China in the month of January. We have worked very effectively with our colleagues in China, and I would also obviously like to challenge others on this. We are a mine of information. We're very, very open. If someone can send us the information that they have, if someone can give us the data that they have, then I'll be very happy to look at it. But I just want to challenge the premise of the meeting is around the failure of WHO, or the failure of China, or the failure of the international community. So in that sense, failure must be based on fact. So what we need to have is a factual discussion.
If you just give me a moment, we have on the panel a representative of the Taiwan embassy, and he's highlighted earlier that how Taiwan was ignored. So you believe that he is misrepresenting the situation?
Sure. Let me have Steve answer that. Certainly, we have many, and I have met personally many excellent colleagues in Taiwan and the Taiwan health authorities and at Taiwan CDC. And I do congratulate the authorities in Taiwan and the doctors and nurses and the epidemiologists in Taiwan for their excellent public health response to this event. And there are many lessons being learned in that. And Maria, to my right here, has had a number of direct conversations with colleagues in Taiwan. They're members of our major expert networks, and they both feed into and learn from the shared learning process at the technical level. From the perspective of global learning and global knowledge, Taiwan is connected to the global health community. The other issues are essentially political, and I will pass to Steve to give you answers to that.
Yeah. Before that, if we can let one of the other panelists, Vincent, if you can possibly respond to what Dr. Ryan has just said in terms of the links that the WHO has with Taiwan, that much of this information that's coming out is simply not a representation of the facts. Vincent, could you?
Well, let me start by saying this. I think we really appreciate Dr. Ryan's remarks, and I think that this does highlight that Taiwan has a lot to contribute on the issue of global health. But let me go into the issue of technical meetings. So it's true that we have had some level of access to expert meetings, but let me share some statistics and some cases. So between 2009 and 2018, we applied to participate in 165 technical meetings. And keep in mind, for most of this period of time, we were invited as an observer to the WHO. So 70% of these requests were denied. In 2009, Taiwan was able to participate in a total of 9 technical meetings, 2 of which were actually open to the public. So contrast this with the hundreds, if not thousands, of technical sessions that are held every year. On information sharing, since 2009, Taiwan has been included in the WHO's IHR mechanism. Yet the WHO refuses to publish Taiwan's contact point on IHR Invent information site, which prevents countries from engaging in the timely report of cases to Taiwan. So I'll give an example of how this is played out. In 2017, actually, a Taiwanese citizen was exposed to tuberculosis on an overseas trip. The country that detected this notified China's IHR contact because Taiwan's contact was not listed. China's CDC took 5 months to notify our CDC. So delays in reporting of COVID-19 cases have also taken place. So we can see where these actions to prevent Taiwan's participation can have real life consequences. So let me again say this. I think we do appreciate the work that the WHO does. I think this is what is driving Taiwan's desire to be a part of it, because we see tremendous value in the WHO. And again, I don't think we're calling for anything that's outside of the bounds of reasonableness. I think we made our intentions clear. We're not seeking membership at this point. What we're doing is we're seeking to be an observer in the WHO, which we believe the DG has authority to grant based on both past practice and precedent.
Thanks so much for that, Vincent. James, I want to bring you in on this. These are some serious accusations being made by Vincent from the Taiwan embassy. You're an independent expert in this field. How do you see this? Does Vincent's claims do they hold any water at all?
Well, two things. I think, first of all, we've obviously seen since the 2000s a even more concerted effort from Beijing to push Taiwan out of international organizations, not just the WHO, but across the board at the UN and other groups. And sometimes I think that those organizations are disingenuous in claiming that they don't have any choice to make, because past precedent does show that they've allowed Taiwan observer status or other important roles, even if there are certain political barriers that ultimately an organization like the WHO can't get around, because it remains, a UN organization that has to follow the dictates of a fairly of a body that in itself has very little choice or democracy or any of these kind of things, and that ultimately ends up playing by Beijing's rules because Beijing forces them to play by those rules. And until the anomaly around Taiwan is resolved, that's not something that an individual organization can't do more than that, than grant observer status and so on, but it can and has done those things in the past. And the fact that it doesn't do those things now is really and obviously blatantly because Beijing has now said that they will throw a temper tantrum if they do, and pretending that it's anything other than Beijing's influence and Beijing's threat is really, I think, really fundamentally ignoring the problem. Secondly, one of the other things I just wanted to pick up on was this idea that it's somehow good that we trust governments, or that government information is necessarily believable or honest. And I think, if anything, the pandemic has proven that that is spectacularly not the case. What the two of the strongest responses, in fact, have come from places whose distrust of China and whose distrust of the information being given out by the Chinese government allowed them to formulate really effective responses. One is Taiwan, of course, which was moving early, where in fact the Taiwanese CDC head was moving on Wuhan on December 31st because he was reading information on online forums that went against the information being given out by the Chinese government, that human-to-human transmission was possible, for instance. And then the other one, of course, is Hong Kong, where Hong Kong's reaction, which has been massively successful, has been almost entirely civic-driven, almost entirely driven by their massive hatred of the Chinese authorities and their own government, and extremely successful as a result, because they voluntarily adopted these measures. Now, if they had listened to the government was telling the Hong Kong people, Hong Kong protesters, started adopting these measures in early January. If they had been listening to their government, they would have wasted weeks. And again, we look at the United States, where the responses have often been socially driven. And in fact, if you were to look at the information being put out by the federal government or by President Trump, you would be being told to drink bleach. Now, groups like the WHO are more confident in calling out that misinformation from the American government than they are from the Chinese government, because, again, as I said, ultimately the American government is less thuggish and nasty than the Chinese government in terms of the type of influence it attempts to wield. But of course, disturbingly, that's now becoming the American government is now becoming more like the Chinese government in things like withdrawing of WHO funding. And I think that's moving towards a worrying space where these institutions ultimately become tossed between these great powers and dishonest governments.
Yeah. Can I just bring in Bethany from that perspective? Bethany, China now controls 4 out of the 15 United Nations agency, and they're not necessarily controlling the WHO, But I think you've touched upon in the past that, you know, China's ambitions, global ambitions, actually does not necessarily mean direct control of the WHO. They actually have other plans in place as well. Do you want to just touch upon that?
Sure. So I think that what we see in a lot of these multilateral organizations, and this is from conversations that I've had with people who work inside them, is that at the very least, what you get is an institutional culture that is very afraid of confrontation with Chinese authorities. And so, for example, if you look at this interview that went viral last month, with I believe it was Dr. Aylward, Bruce Aylward, with a Hong Kong-based news outlet, and he refused to even say the word Taiwan, and refused to give any information or to talk about WHO decision making in response to a reporter's question about Taiwan's inclusion in the WHO. And there was a lot of speculation that maybe there had been some kind of directive from Beijing forbidding people to talk publicly about this issue. But I think it's important to understand that China's influence over multilateral organizations doesn't have to come in the form of an obvious directive like that. It can come from an institutional culture that fears these kinds of diplomatic temper tantrums that Chinese officials are known to throw. And in the case of the WHO, now I would love to hear from the inside what the decisions were, behind, for example, the decision to tweet on January 14th, citing Chinese authorities that the risk of human-to-human transmission was low, even though Taiwanese officials had told the WHO on December 31st that this was likely not the case. And, in fact, Dr. Li Wenliang, who Chinese authorities detained in late December, early January, because he tried to alert colleagues about the danger of the virus. He actually himself was infected by the virus from a patient on January 12th, which was 2 days before that tweet. So I would be very curious, and I would love to know why it was that there was such a delay, that the WHO chose not to make public this information about human-to-human transmission until Chinese authorities made sure that was publicly kosher. And I think that the WHO and officials from the WHO could do so much to alleviate global concerns about China's influence over it by simply answering that question honestly and not accusing people who raised that question of misinformation.
So you made a very good point, Bethany. I'll pass this on to Mr. Solomon at the WHO. Can you hear me? So that's two very pertinent accusations. The fact that everybody around the globe, Mr. Solomon's seen the video with Dr. Bruce Aylward. So all the stats and everything else that you put out there in terms of the interactions you've had with Taiwan and so on, everybody's seen how it was literally completely ignored. He turned off the video. He pretended he didn't hear the journalist. On the other hand, everybody read the tweets that were reiterating almost word for word Beijing's position on human-to-human transfers. So how would you respond to those two accusations?
Okay, well, first of all, I want to express appreciation for the opportunity to address these questions, to be on this, be participating with your panel. Let me also tell you who I am. My name is Stephen Solomon. I'm the Principal Legal Officer for International, Constitutional, and Global Health Law in the Legal Office. I work on those issues as well as on issues involving Taiwan. And I'm going to ask for your indulgence. I'm going to ask specifically for a little bit of time because it's really important, and we've gotten a lot of information. It's very useful. It's really important to have the information set out there. And I'm very happy that there's someone on your panel that we've heard about the Taiwanese issues, because having a discussion, very honestly, having a discussion on this is very important. But if you will give me that time, uninterrupted, to go through this, because I think if we establish a basis for what actually happens, it will be very helpful in I think, understanding these issues.
Yeah, and I fully appreciate it, Mr. Solomon, but you have to appreciate also there's other panelists and this time is limited, so you'll have to make it
Understood.
as succinct as
Understood.
possible. If you
And
can just
we will
address the
be
points,
as
if you can just
patient
address
with
the
them.
points that are put
We
to
will
you.
be as patient with them as you ask for us. But it's because there's so much controversy that I think just a little time on this. So with that, let me say that I'm going to address the questions and the issues raised about Taiwan in two parts. First, there is WHO's public health mandate. That's one part of this. The second part is WHO's status as an international organization composed of and by countries. So on the one hand, in terms of the technical public health mandate, you have WHO staff. This is the doctors, the scientists, the epidemiologists, the researchers, and they focus on the technical and operational public health work. On the other hand, you have the countries. That is, for WHO, 194 member states, and they decide on the policies of the organization, which they set in the World Health Assembly, and on political issues, among the most sensitive of which is membership and participation, both in the governance of the organization. Here we're talking about the World Health Assembly. So countries set the policies of the organization, which staff carries forward. Countries decide on the political issues, in particular, who attends their assemblies. So in the sense of the World Health Assembly, an important aspect here is WHO is part of the UN system. It follows the UN systems on political questions because political issues are the domain of the UN in New York and the General Assembly. The General Assembly in 1971 adopted a decision that recognized the People's Republic of China as the only legitimate representative of China, which is when China took the seat there. 1 year later, in 1972, WHO, through the World Health Assembly, the countries assembled, decided to do the same thing. And that decision hasn't changed since 1971. WHO staff doesn't have the mandate to change that. We don't have the power. That is not what our function is as defined in our Constitution. Our mandate is to carry forward the policies of the organization with the aim of promoting the health of all people everywhere. And I'm going to read how we do that, quoting from the Constitution, because the Constitution, the preambular language I'm about to read, is not mere words, it is our creed. And that is, we work without distinction of race, religion, political belief, economic, or social condition. So we work with all people everywhere, in all areas, and irrespective of geopolitical issues, on technical issues. So I'm going to go through how we do this first in the area of COVID, with Taiwanese experts in particular, and then how we do it in other areas. I'm going to give 5 examples of the first. This is where I'm asking for your indulgence. I'll run through them quickly, but it's worth, I think, the time. And and then I'm going to go through 5 examples of other areas. So first, with respect
Solomon,
to
if
COVID,
you can make it very brief, we have other panelists here as well.
This is an opportunity, if I may, this is an opportunity. So, and I really appreciate it. So the first thing we do on the international health regulations, this is a very important aspect because the international health regulations has an event information site where all states parties have a contact point. Taiwan also has a formal contact point with the same rights of access and the same give and take of information that's available, no restrictions once you have access to that site, as every other member state. Second, Taiwanese experts participate in 2 of the key networks that were stood up for the response. That's the Infection Prevention and Control Network and the Clinical Management Network. And that is where, amongst a relatively small group of international experts, 5 Taiwanese experts participate between those two networks on a weekly basis in sharing IPC information and clinical management information. These networks feed into the production of WHO's information products, gathering all that information from these experts and from their experiences. 3, Taiwanese experts participated in the WHO Global Research and Innovation Forum. This was where the launch of the vaccine acceleration effort began. 4th, Dr. Van Kerkhove and I have briefed directly Taiwanese experts in Taipei through the CDC, discussion about the experiences and information regarding the response. 5th, Taiwanese experts work with us through the European Centers for Disease Prevention and Control, and there are, whenever it is necessary, conference calls with WHO, ECDC, and Taiwanese experts, and there's been a number of cases where we have followed up with them on that. Those are the 5 areas. Thank you for the time. Thank you for listening. I'm going to quickly go through the 5 areas that have ongoing and address themselves to a very broad range of technical public health issues. First, over the course of 2019, Taiwan was invited to 9 expert meetings. They attended 8 of them. These dealt with issues like immunization, drug-resistant TB, vaccine safety, non-communicable diseases, and mental health. Let me, on that issue, I understood the point about the 70%. Here's the issue with the numbers involved. Again, they participated in 8 last year. That's 1 almost every month. We're working for more this year. Not everyone can participate in every expert process. The Health Assembly has established guidelines for participation. They include geographic distribution, gender distribution, expertise distribution, and obviously we have 194 member states, all of whom want to contribute to these expert processes. It has to be fairly distributed, and so 8 is a relatively strong number there. We're looking for more. Secondly, as a general matter, Taiwanese experts and Taiwanese expertise has participated to our work on influenza through the Pandemic Influenza Preparedness Framework. The Taiwanese vaccine manufacturer, Adimune, is a contributor to the Pandemic Influenza Preparedness Framework, the PIP framework, which is an important instrument in preparing for and potentially responding to pandemic influenza. Thirdly, in the fight against cancer, Taiwanese experts have contributed in a number of articles to IARC's Blue Book, and this is an ongoing area. There'll be more contributions in the future. Taiwan, fourthly, has an expert appointed to the IHR expert roster, from which we can draw on expertise for the IHR emergency committee. And then on a wide range of other issues, there are technical bilateral meetings between WHO experts and Taiwanese experts over the course of the last 2 years on the margins of the World Health Assembly and the Executive Board. These meetings, face-to-face with leading Taiwanese experts and the WHO counterparts, have discussed emergency medical teams, bans on additives for cigarettes, IHR reporting and exchange mechanisms, measles-related issue, WHO pre-qualification processes, malaria. These are examples of the broad range of areas we work directly with Taiwanese experts. Also, the 5 examples I gave in the COVID response, the contribution is important to WHO. It contributes to these areas, it contributes to our work overall, and it is, again, in fulfillment of this essential creed of the organization on technical work. When it comes to the question of politics, to participation, membership, or observership in the Health Assembly, that's an issue for member states, needs to be addressed by member states. And it goes to the larger question I think you've raised about the nature of the organization. We take our directives from the World Health Assembly, including directives provided by the IHR, where we are not given powers to compel. We rely on other 2 things, two key, I would say. We rely on leadership and we rely on coordination. And the leadership and coordination are based on relationships and building relationships. Without the power to compel, that will remain a key power that we have. So I'll stop there, and I, again, very much appreciate the time to go through that all.
Thank you so much, Mr. Solomon. So I'd like to bring in Dr. Fidler. You obviously have worked as a legal counsel to the World Health Organization. You're also a recognized independent international expert. I just want you to respond to what Mr. Solomon says, what he said about the interaction they've had with Taiwan, and the interaction between Taiwan and the WHO is not being represented accurately in the international media. How would you address that, Dr.
Well, for me, a lot of the issues surrounding Taiwan and WHO and China in connection with this pandemic is deja vu all over again. The Taiwan's relationship with WHO and WHO's relationship with China has always been difficult. If you're going to have a very serious, deadly disease event happen in China, those political problems are going to arise again with Taiwan. I think the larger issues that we're facing, and I think the larger issues that WHO honestly are facing, are not centered on Taiwan. The United States government neither relies solely on WHO information, nor does it rely solely on information that Taiwan provides to WHO for getting ready to deal with any kind of serious disease event that breaks out around the world. So I'm a little bit concerned that this has become, a panel and a seminar on Taiwan's relationship with WHO. I personally don't think that's the centerpiece of the real political problems I think WHO confronts now. And I think a lot of those problems have to do with the way in which, I think Mike Ryan said this, that the great powers are weaponizing this pandemic for things that have nothing to do with global health. And that's a serious concern with regards to how WHO continues to make contributions to dealing with this pandemic. And then what does WHO or even global health governance look like coming out of this pandemic?
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Dr. Fidler. I fully appreciate this is not a panel on Taiwan, but I do have to give time to Vincent, from the representative from Taiwan, to respond to some of the claims that were made by the WHO. So my question to Vincent, surely what Mr. Solomon is saying makes perfect sense. Rules are rules. Taiwan is not a member of the WHO, according to the 1971 UN decision. And in fact, Taiwan's only recognized in 14 countries out of 193. And, so irrespective of how you and I may feel how the WHO should have behaved, the rules are the rules. Taiwan is not a member. But despite that, there's been multiple interactions between the WHO and Taiwan, as Mr. Solomon has highlighted. How would you respond to that?
Azim, thank you for giving me the opportunity to respond, because I do think it's important. And again, I agree with David that this should not be the only issue, but hopefully, this is part of the equation, and we can get through this issue and move on to other and bigger issues that we have to cover during this panel. But let me before I get back to the issue of 2758 and WHA 251, let me quickly respond to Mr. Solomon's points about Taiwan's participation. The first point he made, and I think this one, let me look through this so I didn't clear. You mentioned the event information site, and that there is a give and take process in this site. But to our understanding, the Taiwan contact point is actually missing from the event information site. So countries that do feel a need to share information with Taiwan are unable to directly contact the Taiwanese point of contact within that site itself, which is why we had that example in 2017 of a country notifying China's CDC of a tuberculosis exposure in flight, and that China only allowed Taiwan to know about that case 5 months after they were first notified of it. So that still remains, I think, a deficiency. The second point was on the two key WHO networks, and it's true that Taiwanese experts have been invited to one of the teleconferences, but no invitation has yet been forthcoming for the lab network teleconference. On the third point, Taiwan had requested two Taiwanese experts to attend the meeting in Geneva. However, the WHO would only allow them to attend in personal capacity and then only in an online session. So there was a different rule of attendance for Taiwanese experts within the Global Research Innovation Forum that you mentioned. On the fourth point and the fifth point, we do appreciate the WHO's efforts in those regards. On the second large point you mentioned, which is in regards to the expert meetings, not 8 of 9 expert meetings, the WHO holds hundreds, if not thousands of technical meetings every year. And I think, it is something worth exploring whether 8 or 9 technical meetings a year is sufficient to fulfill kind of the health needs of Taiwanese health experts, particularly on some of these pressing issues that you have made mention of. And the second point on the rejection rate, I think it's also, as a good point of comparison, worth looking into the rejection rates of technical participation into technical meetings for other countries. Does Taiwan at 70% have an abnormally high rejection rate? And if it does, why does Taiwan have a higher rejection rate? So I think from a legal perspective, those are questions looking into. Overall, I just wanted to quickly mention this. Mr. Solomon mentioned that Taiwan's participation is a matter for member states. We don't think that's necessarily the case. For years, Taiwan has applied for observership in the WHO, not membership in the body itself. And you have historical examples dating back from the 1950s, as for example, the Order of Malta and others, show that the DG does have the authority to make these invitations without determination of political status. So we think that DG has this authority to invite Taiwan, and we urge him to do so. The WHO refers to UN General Assembly 2758 and WHA's 25.1 as settling the issue of Taiwan. I would like to say that on the issue of observership, given that it does not imply political recognition, we don't think that these articles should be relevant. But more broadly speaking, we would encourage our viewers to Google these articles because you'll see Taiwan isn't mentioned at all. So for us, the question of the effective representation of Taiwan's 23 million people remains unsettled. And this is a position that is also supported by a number of WHO member states. So the only country really, and I'll wrap this up now, the only country that has a fundamental stake in keeping Taiwan out is China. Not because they can provide for the health of our 23 million citizens, they can't, but because of their own political purposes, which is why they urged Taiwan to participate between 2009 and 2017, but later withdraw that support following our own democratic election. So Mr. Solomon states that member states with an S, not member state, are responsible for Taiwan's membership. But in 2017, DG Chen, the former DG of the WHO, mentioned that she specifically went through China's approval before she agreed to extend an invitation to Taiwan. So it seems that in the case of Taiwan itself, sometimes member state perhaps is bigger than member states. And we would strongly urge, again, the WHO to disabuse the PRC's ability to play politics on issues of global health and invite Taiwan as an observer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vincent. We'd love to stay on the issue of Taiwan. Fascinating, but obviously there's many more issues to discuss, so we have to move on quite swiftly. So we have a question here, a number of questions pouring in from people around the globe. But before I do that, before I launch into those, I'd just like to say for a lot of those people that are joining us, you're listening to a webinar from the Centre for Global Policy. You can find us on cgpolicy.org or look us up at Twitter, which is CGPDC. Please do look us up whilst you listen to this podcast. So I want to pose a question to James. There's a question from Charles Lavery, who's the editor-in-chief of the Oman Times, former editor-in-chief of the Oman Times and currently with Reuters. And he wants to know is that are China's diplomats now doing more harm than good? And there's essentially mixed messages that are coming from Beijing. And why is that the case? A country's diplomats are obviously there to further the interest of that country, but are its diplomats now actually doing more harm to China's image than they were in the past? That's for James.
Oh yes, undoubtedly so. We've seen this big move in the last 3 months towards this what's called Wolf Warrior type diplomacy. Wolf Warrior 2 was a very successful kind of Rambo type film that showed a imaginary Chinese military operation in Africa. And the diplomacy that goes along with this style is this extremely aggressive, conspiratorialist, unpleasant, kind of threatening presence by Chinese officials on Twitter, in interviews and so on, where, for instance, they've been threatening the Australian government. They've claimed that the US military is behind the pandemic. All these really wild claims that are very different from the traditional Chinese style of diplomacy. And in fact, we've seen some Chinese diplomats push back against this, and it's clear that there's something of a mini struggle going on within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, whereby the traditionalists are trying to squash these people. Most notable of the new trolls was Zhao Lijian, who was in Pakistan, where he temporarily adopted the name Muhammad Zhao Lijian in order to try and appeal to Pakistan before China instituted a ban on Islamic names as part of its campaign of cultural genocide in Xinjiang. And he then rapidly dropped that, and he's pioneered this style of really aggressive nastiness and accusations and insults. And he's been promoted to be spokesman of the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. And what disturbingly seems to be the case is that that type of diplomacy has become a way for people to advance their careers because it's seen as appealing to the very top. And within Chinese systems, as within any system, people's personal motivations, their own careerism and greed, can clash with the actual needs of the country. Now, good systems regulate and control that. But because the Chinese system is in such a state of intense politicized and paranoia and ideological extremism at the moment, instead we're seeing those voices being given more and more prominence by the Chinese system itself and being rewarded. And so people who don't even necessarily believe in that attitude are starting to adopt it. Other Chinese ambassadors are starting to adopt it because they see it as being the way that's approved by Beijing. And that's really dangerous, not only for China, which is frankly getting into fights it can't win and blowing its chance for successful PR as a result of this by becoming aggressive, but it puts organizations that have to deal with China, such as the WHO, such as the UN, even like sporting groups, in this really tricky position where they're having to ignore this stuff. Because they can't comment on it or push back against it. They can comment on or push back against idiocy by the United States or idiocy by European populists, but they can't push back against this stuff from China because this stuff has now such high level official endorsement.
Thanks so much. I'd like to pose the same question to Bethany. You're obviously somebody that follows China very closely. I believe you also have a book appearing on this subject. I think it's called Beijing Rules. In terms of Chinese diplomats, are they now doing more damage than good in terms of China's PR image?
It's really hard to see what kind of international good is being done when Chinese diplomats, such as last year when the Chinese ambassador to Sweden referred to many Swedish people as jackals. It's hard to see what good that could possibly do on an international basis, especially when China is very involved right now in the project of trying to make itself appear as a more reliable and better partner than the United States on the global stage. And it's not just with Western countries that we're seeing this kind of rhetoric from Chinese diplomats. A couple of weeks ago, more than a dozen African nations wrote, a diplomat signed a letter to China raising complaints about how their citizens were being treated in southern China. And on Twitter, diplomats in Zimbabwe and other countries denied that, called it misinformation, said that it wasn't true. In India, a Chinese diplomat has used really similar, just needlessly inflammatory language to insult Indian people. This is not winning anybody's hearts and minds anywhere. And I think what James said about this really being done as a form of careerism because it's popular right now at the top is a really great way to look at it. Now, as James also mentioned, it seems that there's probably there's a fight maybe going on, a struggle within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And you can look at the Chinese ambassador to the US, Cui Tiankai, who's really more of a previous generation of who speak more carefully, who are very seasoned diplomats from the Chinese system who really adhere to the previous model, which is to just not comment very much at all, and when they do, to do so in a very diplomatic manner, typically. He essentially denounced Zhao Lijian's, some of his claims and said that they were crazy. And it's interesting to me because if you look, last year, the last 6 months of last year, there was clearly a decision made in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to encourage and allow, and in fact have a policy for Chinese diplomats and embassies to open Twitter accounts. This is a very different and very dramatic departure from the past decade, when there were very few official Chinese diplomatic accounts on Twitter. And of course, Twitter is blocked in China. But the last 6 months of last year, we saw dozens upon dozens of verified Chinese diplomatic accounts opened. And I wonder if some part of this is just a little bit of a learning curve. Twitter, like many social media platforms, rewards people for stunning rhetoric, for emotional rhetoric. Those are the kinds of tweets that tend to get attention. And perhaps this is just some growing pains on the part of the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But if so, they need to do what there's plenty of precedent for around the world, and get a social media policy going to prevent these, this needless sense that China views less powerful countries as literally gum stuck to the bottom of their shoe, which is what Hu Xijin, who's also on Twitter, recently wrote about Australia. He described Australia as gum stuck to the bottom of the Chinese shoe. So that's not winning any love for China right now.
Thanks so much, Bethany. This question from for Dr. Fidler is from Ambassador Rashid Ahmed from the Bangladeshi Embassy. And this pandemic has obviously shown that there's been a global failure in institutions. What kind of reappraisal do you think would be required for the world to examine why, especially the big powers, with immense wealth, immense reach, why they failed in such a catastrophic kind of fashion? As somebody who's worked in the inside and outside, how would you have a reappraisal of how things went wrong?
Well, I think it's critical for China and the United States to rethink their approaches. And let me just quickly walk through this. The way, and the conversations that we've been having just, right before this, about the way in which China now is engaging in diplomacy around the world. When balance of power politics returns in a serious way, all issues, including now global health, gets distorted according to that geopolitical lens. And in some cases, with issues such as military power, economic well-being, those things are, the lens gets distorted in ways that are very difficult to deal with. What we're trying to focus on here in connection with global health is to try to find a way in which we do not see global health weaponized again in connection with a deadly pandemic. And I think that requires a number of steps. And I think the United States and China have to rethink their approach to this, because this is getting in the way of both, I think, from a national point of view. I know in the United States, this anti-WHO, anti-China rhetoric isn't really helping us understand the things that we have the power to do, that we do not depend on WHO, we do not depend on what Chinese diplomats are doing, and we've made mistakes, we have made failures. It's the United States that's threatening to withdraw funding from the WHO because it perceives for some reason that that's an important way to move forward, both in connection with how it views the risk or the threat from China, as well as how it views the risk from WHO. So I think as part of this exercise that we're going to have in terms of reviewing different responses with regards to national and global health issues coming out of this pandemic, I think, and that's a review that perhaps should start sooner rather than later. I think doing that kind of review might help countries step back from the sort of political abyss that we seem to be on, especially in connection with making WHO, without justification, a scapegoat in this larger geopolitical context. And I think that leadership has to come not from the Director General of WHO, it has to come from the countries that have put the WHO in this geopolitical vice.
Thanks so much for that, Dr. Fidler. Bethany, I think you wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, I want to say that I definitely agree with David's point just now, that the reason that the United States has almost 1 million confirmed cases and was getting close to 60,000 deaths from coronavirus. That has nothing, or essentially nothing, to do with what the World Health Organization did or did not say or do in the first few weeks of January. This is a crisis of our own making. And it's definitely correct that some people, some US government officials in the Trump administration are criticizing the WHO and China as a way to deflect blame for their own failures. That is eminently clear. I think that both of these things are true at the same time, that it's important to talk about what's happened with the WHO, but at the same time to say that the United States is responsible for its own failures in handling the epidemic.
Thank you so much, Bethany. It's a question for Mr. Stephen Solomon from the WHO. Got a two-pronged question. Can you hear me there? Mr. Solomon?
We can hear you. Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes,
Go ahead.
yes.
Yes, there's a two-pronged question. One of the questions is from Dr. Zahir Sahloul, who's the president of Med Global, an international global relief organization. He wants to know about the WHO's record in Syria in particular, where they've come under the same sort of accusations in terms of pandering to an autocratic regime and only going through the regime forces to provide services to the people. So that's the first part of the question. The second part of the question is that is the WHO fit for purpose for the future, or do you think more multilateral agencies will be beneficial for the world? Because clearly it seems that the extent of the WHO doesn't go around the globe. So is it not better to have multiple agencies, maybe one in Europe, one in Latin America, that can then all coordinate, or do you think a single agency is what's needed? So it's a two-pronged question there.
Hi, so I'm gonna start with that. I'm Maria Van Kerkhove. I'm the technical lead for the COVID-19 response. So thanks for having us, and thanks for these questions. I'll try to be very, very brief. Just to say that we work with everyone everywhere, and that's our mandate. And it's really important that it's clear on this. I wanted to just touch upon what one of the earlier accusations around the slow to respond, and just kind of very briefly say, from the 31st of December, when we were alerted to this through our event management system and of this case of a cluster of pneumonia, we immediately activated our systems. On the 1st of January, we initiated our incident management system. And on the 5th of January was the first time we notified all of our member states and contact points. There was detailed information about the cluster itself, which we learned from Wuhan. Our information product talked about acute respiratory infections and protections that you need to take from there, which talks about droplets and how this virus is transmitted. On the 10th and the 11th of January was the first time that we issued our comprehensive technical package of guidance. And in so, we put in guidance of how to protect people from getting infected, and specifically instructed and gave guidance around how to protect for human-to-human transmission, which is the prevention of respiratory droplets and contact transmission. And I think that's really important because from the start, given that this was a cluster of pneumonia, given that this was a respiratory pathogen, of course, you assume that there would be or could be human-to-human transmission, always. And so our guidance from day one acted on that. On the 14th of January, I did my first press conference on the topic. And even though we didn't have a report of human-to-human transmission, we discussed the possibility of human-to-human transmission. And I even went further and said that given that this was a coronavirus and given that this was a respiratory pathogen, you're really worried about super spreading events in healthcare facilities in particular, because that's a hallmark of coronaviruses and hallmarks of emerging respiratory pathogens. So right from the start, we were warning people, we were alerting people that this was a possibility. You mentioned something about data and data that we get from countries. Of course, we report on what countries report to us, but we always ask for more information. Every single country, every single area, every single contact point that we have in all over the world, we ask more questions, always. Yeah. And we always want more details around that. But I think it's important because you brought up specifically the issue of human-to-human transmission, and you mentioned one tweet. WHO does not give guidance through Twitter. WHO alerts the world through different mechanisms. Our guidance comes through our guidance materials and our interactions with member states, our interactions with researchers. I have had wonderful exchanges with Taiwanese researchers from Taiwan CDC and other public health professionals, and I assure you that we're listening. We listen to every country, every person, everywhere,
Maria,
and how
if
they're
you
dealing with this.
We've covered a lot of this area earlier. If you could just address the 2 points I mentioned on the
Yes.
issue of Syria and if the issue of multilateral agencies, if that's required, if you can just address those points.
Yes, but thanks for the opportunity to cover those other things because
so
they
much.
were addressed and I wanted to make sure that we hit those points.
Yes, and I'll speak to the issue of Syria and to many other areas. We have been highlighting for months the particular risk faced by countries affected by fragility, conflict and vulnerability. We issued interagency guidelines with our colleagues in UNHCR and the Red Cross movement, one of our first major guidelines around how to deal with, prevent and manage COVID-19 in the context of vulnerability, conflict, displacement and large refugee movements. We have offices in all of the major emergency countries. We have worked with the Humanitarian Coordination System. Our Assistant Director General, Ibrahima Sosef Fall, co-chairs the Interagency Standing Committee of Principals on Interventions in Humanitarian Settings with Mark Lowcock. We, the Director General, co-launched the humanitarian appeal addressing the needs of people in these situations a number of weeks ago, and we're very pleased to see that appeal achieving a high level of funding across many UN and other agencies, especially our colleagues in the Red Cross movement. With the specific reference to Syria, and I can speak from personal experience, I was the Middle East Polio Response Coordinator back in 2013, and I can tell you, trying to vaccinate millions of children in northern Syria and in Damascus-controlled Syria, and doing that, I could speak here about the things we've had to do to maintain cross-line, cross-border operations. WHO has worked diligently in northwest Syria, in northeast Syria, in Syria controlled from Damascus over the last 5-6 more years. We have delivered healthcare and have been actually in northeast Syria with the single organization with the greatest responsibility for the highest proportion of the population in terms of supplies. I'd probably like to ask you where you all were maybe 2 months ago when we were fighting like hell to keep the Yarabia crossing open from Iraq into northeast Syria. And when this was at the Security Council, I didn't see a whole lot of reporting around that and how we were desperate to keep supplies going to the populations in northeast Syria. We're still struggling with that issue. We're still struggling with cross-border, cross-lines and supply chains there. The global supply chains have broken. Maintaining humanitarian supply chains, health system supply chains in Syria has been a constant struggle for us. Our teams are present both on the Iraqi side, the Turkish side, and on the Damascus side of this conflict. And we will endeavour to continue, very often at risk of the lives of our staff, to continue to do that. There are real sensitivities, and we're now dealing with many other issues in northeast Syria around where lab samples are taken, where disease is reported. And we're trying to work through those issues with our colleagues in Damascus, in northeast Syria, in northwest Syria. We're dealing with multiple authorities, and again, we're trying to deal with infectious diseases and health systems in the middle of a geopolitical shooting war. We did the same in northeast Congo, and we have lost and we have spilt blood in the middle of a geopolitical conflict. And we have stayed there for 1.5 years, and our staff have been shot at, killed, beaten in their attempts to serve people in conflict. So from our perspective, we are doing what we can. The world, and I agree with you, Mr. Fiedler, the weaponization of health is just not helping anywhere. We need health and peace. We need peace for health and health for peace. The Secretary General has called for a global ceasefire around these issues. And I think we could all take a lesson. But if you know, from our perspective, and we thank those of you who speak out on these issues. But again, we have to be, we're a member state organization. We don't engage in public humiliation or ridicule of our member states. We reserve our criticisms for our direct relationships because we must preserve our capacity to act. We can be very righteous and we can be very right, but we have no access. Our job is to maintain access to vulnerable populations, and we will do that whatever the cost. And we will not play politics with health and public health. I will not play politics with public health, neither will Director General Dr. Tedros. We are focused on delivering healthcare to people, and I thank you all for your support, because humanitarian situations right now are probably the greatest threat right now in this pandemic response.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Ryan. I think everybody appreciates the great efforts that you and your team are doing on the front line and the sacrifices that you have made on behalf of all of us. So we obviously very short of time now, so two quick questions before we move on. First of all, the next question is for Vincent. This is from Alexander Walker from New Century Media in London, and he wants to know essentially about China's disinformation campaign and how the West is responding to that. We obviously seen Russian disinformation in the last US election, and the US seems to be fighting the last battle, and the Chinese have seemed to have taken a leaf out of that book and are replicating some of their tactics and strategy. And you this field in terms of tackling the misinformation coming from Beijing. What would your recommendations be to the US? That's for Vincent.
Okay, I'll be very brief on this because this is partially related to the WHO, but not entirely. So I'll be very brief. Disinformation is obviously an issue we're very focused on. We're probably, the country most at risk of disinformation anywhere in the world. We share, a very similar kind of historical culture. We have the same language with essentially our biggest adversary across the strait. So there's obviously a lot of disinformation and misinformation going on from China into Taiwan. We saw this in our prior elections. We saw this in our most recent election to a lesser degree. But we've also seen this actually on the issue of public health, and it's entirely different than I think what many other countries have seen. There's part of it. There's the disinformation on the coronavirus itself. There's the the wrong medical guidelines that are spreading through social media. But there is on top of that also a very political dimension to it. And for example, this manifested itself partially on some of the personal attacks that we've seen against Dr. Tedros. There was an initial, I think, phase of personal attacks that Dr. Tedros has made reference to earlier in the year. And there is a lot of suspicion. You can't deny that part of it may be due to the emotional outbursts by some Taiwanese citizens, but there is also ample evidence that we're studying that part of this was also motivated by people with political intentions, particularly those coming from the other side of the Taiwan Strait. And we saw a much clearer example of this actually following Dr. Tedros' comments about the origins of these personal attacks, when a lot of these Chinese netizens using simplified Chinese characters and having accounts that link to Weibo accounts and other accounts, went on to Dr. Tedros' Facebook to supposedly, claim responsibility and apologize on behalf of the Taiwanese people. We don't want to see these racist attacks. We don't want to see personal attacks against anybody. We don't want to see them at a time of an international pandemic, but this is just evidence of the sort of coordinated disinformation campaign we're seeing. And so the only recommendation I would really give at this point is more public awareness of these efforts. We have to recognize that there are stakeholders around the world that have a vested interest in degrading our democracies, including here in the United States, through disinformation. And because if we have awareness, we're better able to form a coordinated response to it from a whole of society level, rather than just being a government-led kind of initiative.
Thank you so much, Vincent. There's a question for James. This question's coming from Professor Edward Mortimer, who's a professor at All Souls College in Oxford. He was also the former Director of Communications for the United Nations and Chief Speechwriter for Kofi Annan. And he wants to know about, we haven't heard much about Donald Trump. Biden is now accusing Trump of being too soft on China. Perhaps some of the panelists could talk upon that. Do you think, James, that this is going to be a serious election issue? Some of these accusations that are going backward and forward, who's pro-China and who's anti-China?
Yeah, I think we're moving into a period where we're effectively looking at a new Cold War between China and the US. And a lot of people don't like that term, but I think that that's the reality that we're going to have to live with. And much as with the first Cold War, we're now seeing that point where each side accuses the other of not being strong enough. We're going to have, you think of the who lost China debate back in 1950, 1951. The debates over the Korean War, and this is a pattern that's unfortunately very familiar. Now, of course, the problem is that both sides are hypocritical and are playing with fire on this, because a lot of this stuff strays right over the border into racism against Asian Americans, particularly the stuff being put forward by the Trump administration and its allies, who are who have been systematically targeting reporters of Chinese descent who criticize them, for instance, and accusing them of being agents of Beijing when they've been long-term critics of the CCP or analysts of the CCP. So I think inevitably we're going to see this as a major campaign issue. I think that both parties are going to make a mess of it. The Republicans worse than the Democrats in terms of the racism and hypocrisy of it. And I think that's, unfortunately, I don't think there's anything that can be done about that at this point. I mean, again, if we go back to the First Cold War, the First Cold War didn't start with a pandemic originating in the Soviet Union that then went on to kill tens of thousands of American people, and we can only imagine what it would have looked like if it had. So I think the ugliness and the ferocity of this kind of new era of geopolitical conflict is going to be beyond anything we've seen for decades.
Thanks so much, Jim. Same question to you, Bethany, as another leading China expert. How do you think China will play a role in this election?
I think what we're going to see is that Trump and the Trump campaign is going to use it over and over and over again as a bludgeon against Biden, and it will be very difficult for Biden to respond to that in an effective way. So let me talk about some of these competing ad campaigns over the past couple of weeks as an example. So the Trump campaign has put forward several ads that portray Biden as very weak on China, as supporting China's growth. They have a quote from him saying that a prosperous China is something that the US should support, from a speech he gave in China in Sichuan, I believe, a number of years ago. And also accusing his son, or sort of the innuendos that his son is making money off of China, and thus there's a level of corruption there. So you're seeing a lot of these kinds of attacks now, a nascent attack coming from the Trump campaign. They have a hashtag Beijing Biden. Then we also saw last week the Biden campaign then put forward an ad basically doing the opposite, saying that Biden has been strong against China and criticizing Trump and the Trump administration of a weak response on China, of appeasing Beijing in the early weeks of the coronavirus, of praising China's response, of praising Xi Jinping, and of saying that Biden will be strong against China. But what happened was Democrats, many of them, accused and stated that this Biden ad put forward by the Biden campaign was racist. And to go on to draw further along what James mentioned, Democrats are really paralyzed right now because their party has mobilized to support Asian Americans who have been the target of a dramatic rise of racist attacks here in the US. And they seem to view any statements that are criticizing China right now, or even tying, highlighting the connection between China and the coronavirus, with a risk of raising this level of racism. And so Democrats feel they really can't talk about China very much right now because of that, and they're feeling pressure from their base on that. And so in the campaign, they're in a really difficult position, which is that it is so clear to everyone in the world that China is powerful and that it doesn't always use that power in a good way. And it's very clear that China has the US in its sights in some ways, and is actively trying to portray itself as a more reliable and more trustworthy partner, especially in global health leadership, but in many other areas. And it's very easy for Republicans to attack China, to say they have a double reason to do it, right? Because they want to deflect blame for their own failure, for the Trump administration's domestic failures. And so it's a great strategy to do that, is to deflect blame onto China. And then also they see that Democrats are in a very weak position. So I think what we're going to see is the China card being used very effectively by Republicans, and Democrats really struggling to address important issues regarding China that should be addressed.
Thanks so much, Bethany. Question for Dr. Fiedler from Dean Baxendale. Wants to know about the global inquiry about this pandemic. And so far, we've obviously seen that China doesn't seem to be very cooperative in this inquiry. And if one does not have access to the ground, then obviously the inquiry is going to be deficient in many ways. Who do you think should be leading such an inquiry? And how do you think we should get around access to China for the inquiry into COVID-19?
Well, at the moment, there is no formal multilateral, or what would people would perceive as a legitimate review of responses of countries or international organizations to this outbreak. Australia has proposed an investigation. The United States, the Trump administration, is doing its own review of WHO's performance in connection with the freeze on funding. We know that typically in connection with disease events of this significance, that these sorts of assessment, reviews, lessons learned, recommendations happens. My colleague at CFR, Tom Boyke, and I have recently proposed that the UN Secretary General should start an interim review process so that it's multilateral, it can be considered legitimate, and it begins to look at some of the things that we need to, for purposes of first, prevailing over this pandemic, and secondly, preparing for future pandemics. That the review that we proposed that could be organized by the UN Secretary General is not designed to do any more of this political finger pointing. But we think that if that interim review could start sooner rather than later, that might create political space and time for WHO to be able to do what it needs to do in connection with this pandemic, especially as the pandemic begins to affect more seriously low-income countries, which really rely on the capabilities of the organization from the scientific, medical, and public health points of view. The fact that China might not be willing to participate in such a review doesn't mean that we don't have treasure troves of information about what has happened in China that could be provided in that review process. I mean, this is part of what is so aggravating about the Trump administration's position with regards to WHO, because we have our own sources of information about what happens everywhere. We do not depend, nor do we rely solely on information that comes from WHO or Taiwan or any individual country. And so we have questions that we have to answer about with whom did we share this information during the early weeks of the outbreak. And so I think, a review process can bring different streams together, even if certain countries are reluctant to participate in such a review. And I think that would be important, again, for the two primary purposes of one, let's prevail against this pandemic. Let's not undermine WHO at this critical moment. And secondly, let's learn the lessons from the mistakes made by everybody to get ready for the next, serious disease outbreak, which we know will happen.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fidler. So on that note, getting ready for the next pandemic, we have to wrap up. First of all, I'd like to thank all the panelists for participating in this very rich discussion. Hopefully we've all come away having learned some more. And before I sign off, I'd also like to give my thanks to representatives of the WHO who are doing a stellar job in many countries in difficult circumstances. I'd also like to point out that do look us up on cgpolicy.org. Do have a look at our Twitter account, CGPDC, and where you can find out information about other events that we're having soon. And thank you very much once again, and everybody stay safe. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.